On April 14, 1935, people on the southern Great Plains watched daylight disappear. The day later became known as Black Sunday. A wall of dust rose over farms and towns, turning noon into darkness and forcing families to shelter under wet cloths, blankets, and anything that could filter the air. This was not a single freak storm. It was the most frightening sign of a wider collapse across parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. The land itself seemed to be moving, and the people living there had to ask how soil that once promised abundance had become a black sky.
The disaster began before the storm arrived. The Great Plains were grassland, shaped by deep-rooted prairie plants that held soil through drought, wind, fire, and grazing. During decades of expansion, millions of acres were plowed for wheat and other crops. High prices during World War I encouraged farmers to break more sod. Tractors made the work faster. Rainy years made the risk look smaller than it was. When the weather turned dry, the exposed topsoil had little protection. What looked like progress became a fragile surface waiting for wind. Drought was the immediate trigger. Rain failed across large areas, crops withered, and fields lay bare. But drought alone does not explain the Dust Bowl. The catastrophe came from drought meeting land use that had removed the prairie's natural armor. Wind could lift loose soil from one field, carry it across counties, and drop it inside houses, lungs, engines, barns, and food. Dust entered clocks, beds, schools, and churches. It was not just outside weather. It crossed the threshold and made every room part of the storm. Black blizzards became terrifyingly familiar. Some dust storms rolled in as brown curtains. Others approached like mountains. Static electricity crackled. Cars stalled because dust clogged engines. Livestock suffocated or starved when pastures vanished. Children developed dust pneumonia after breathing particles for days and weeks. Families tried to seal windows with rags, but the dust still came through. The word storm usually suggests something that passes. On the plains, the storms returned often enough to become a way of life, grinding hope down grain by grain. Economic pressure made the environmental crisis worse. The Great Depression had already lowered crop prices and tightened credit. Many farmers owed money on land, equipment, seed, or rent. To survive, they sometimes plowed more, even as the soil failed. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers were especially vulnerable because they had little cushion when crops died. A family could lose income, then animals, then machinery, then the farm itself. The Dust Bowl was therefore not only a weather event, it was an environmental disaster tied to markets, debt, and desperation. Government photographers later documented the human cost. Images from the Farm Security Administration show abandoned houses, buried fences, exhausted families, and migrants on the road. Those photographs became part of how America remembers the Dust Bowl. They were evidence, but they were also arguments, proof that policy, relief, and reform were urgent. The camera made distant suffering visible to people who had never tasted dust in their water or watched a field leave in the wind. The archive remains powerful because the faces are not symbols first. They are people living inside a broken landscape. Migration followed. Some families packed cars and trucks and headed west, especially toward California, hoping for agricultural work. The label Okie was often used harshly, even for migrants who did not come from Oklahoma. Camps filled with people who had lost farms or jobs. Their journey became one of the defining stories of the 1930s. But leaving was not simple liberation. Migrants met low wages, suspicion, crowded camps, and competition for seasonal labor. The dust did not end at the state line. It traveled with people as debt, grief, memory, and stigma. The federal response changed how the United States thought about soil. New Deal programs promoted contour plowing, terracing, strip cropping, shelter belts, and leaving crop residue to protect fields. The Soil Conservation Service argued that erosion was not an individual farmer's private problem. It was a national problem because soil was a public foundation for food, settlement, and stability. Demonstration projects showed that different techniques could reduce erosion. The lesson was radical in its simplicity. Land could not be treated as an endless surface for extraction. Tree belts became one symbol of that new thinking. Rows of trees were planted across parts of the plains to slow wind and protect farms.
They did not solve everything, and not every plan worked as promised, but they showed a shift from conquering the land to working with its limits. Farmers also changed practices when rain returned and when conservation knowledge spread. The Dust Bowl did not end because one heroic solution arrived. It eased through weather, policy, adaptation, and hard experience, each factor depending on the others. The memory of the Dust Bowl remains relevant because the underlying risks never vanished. Drought still returns. Grasslands can still be overused. Groundwater can still be depleted. Climate change can intensify heat and stress water systems. Modern equipment is more powerful than 1930s machinery, which means mistakes can happen faster. Conservation methods are better understood, but economics can still push land beyond safe limits. The Dust Bowl warns that environmental disasters often begin quietly, as reasonable decisions repeated across a huge landscape. Black Sunday is remembered for darkness at midday, but its deeper meaning is about visibility. The storm made hidden processes visible: soil loss, drought vulnerability, agricultural expansion, debt, and the false belief that technology had defeated climate. When the dust cloud crossed towns, it showed people what had been happening under their feet for years. A field is not just dirt, it is biology, history, labor, weather, and time. When it blows away, an entire society discovers that the ground was never guaranteed. The black storm that swallowed the plains was not the end of the Great Plains, and it was not proof that people should never farm dry country. It was proof that land has memory and limits. The families who endured it left behind more than dramatic photographs. They left a warning about what happens when optimism outruns ecology. In the Dust Bowl, the sky turned black because the earth had been exposed. That sentence still matters. Every generation has to decide whether it will protect the ground beneath its future, or wait until the future rises into the air. One reason the Dust Bowl still holds attention is that it turned a slow disaster into a visible spectacle. Soil erosion usually sounds technical, almost invisible, but the storms made it cinematic and terrifying. A family could sweep a room in the morning and find new dust by afternoon. Schools closed when the air became dangerous. Trains slowed because crews could not see the track. In some towns, people tied ropes between buildings so they could move through dust without becoming lost. These details show that the crisis was not abstract. It reorganized the smallest routines of life. The Dust Bowl also complicated the American idea of independence. Farmers were often praised as self-reliant, but erosion ignored property lines. One exposed field could damage another farm miles away. A county could not protect itself if neighboring counties kept losing soil. That reality forced a new environmental politics, one that treated conservation as cooperation rather than private preference. The lesson was uncomfortable because it meant freedom on the land depended partly on restraint. In the 1930s, the wind made that argument with more force than any speech could. When rain finally returned, memories of the black storms did not disappear. Some survivors stayed and rebuilt. Others made new lives elsewhere. Conservation districts, scientific monitoring, and soil practices became part of the region's future. Yet the Dust Bowl remains a warning, precisely because it was not caused by ignorance alone. Many people made rational choices under pressure, and those choices added up to catastrophe. That is why the story matters beyond the 1930s. It asks how societies behave when short-term survival collides with long-term limits.